You're looking at a photograph from the 1978 U.S. Nationals. It's grainy, taken on 35mm film, showing a Ford Fairmont sitting in the staging lanes. To the casual observer, it's just a race car waiting for its turn. But if you look closer, really close, you'll see something that defies physics. It's 90 degrees in Indianapolis that day. The asphalt is radiating heat like a pizza oven. Sweat is dripping off the crew members. And yet, there is frost, actual white crystalline ice forming on the hood scoop of Bob Glidden's car. This isn't just a cooling trick. It is the visual evidence of the greatest heist in drag racing history. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the gray areas in the rulebook that turn mechanics into legends. If you're someone who loves the engineering battles just as much as the driving, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Look, usually when we talk about cheating in racing, we're talking about hidden fuel tanks, acid-dipped body panels, or oversized engines, the brute force stuff. But what happened in the late 70s wasn't brute force. It was thermodynamics, weaponized by a guy who worked out of a two-car garage in Indiana. Bob Glidden didn't just find a loophole. He found a way to change the weather inside his engine. And the craziest part? The NHRA officials were staring right at it for 2 years and didn't have a clue. To really understand the magnitude of this, we have to go back to 1978. The landscape of American muscle was, well, bleak. The showroom floors were full of choked-down, emission-strangled cruisers that couldn't spin a tire on wet pavement. But on the track, Pro Stock was the last bastion of the factory hot rod. It was war. You had the General Motors juggernaut with Grumpy Jenkins and the sheer engineering might of the Chevy big blocks. You had the Mopar camp with their Hemis, which were basically ancient deities of horsepower. And then you had Ford. Ford was in a weird spot. They had abandoned the factory racing support that defined the 60s. The total performance era was dead. So you had Bob Glidden, essentially a privateer, carrying the blue oval banner almost entirely on his own back. He was running a Ford Fairmont. Now, for those of you who didn't live through the late 70s, the Fairmont was not a cool car. It was a boxy, sensible family sedan designed to replace the Maverick. It was the car your high school geography teacher drove. But Glidden saw something else. He saw a shorter wheelbase, decent aerodynamics, and a platform that could hold the 351 Cleveland engine. Here's what most people don't realize about Pro Stock in that era. It was a game of thousands. We aren't talking about seconds, we are talking about slivers of time so small they're hard to comprehend. The difference between qualifying number one and going home early was often less than the time it takes to blink. When the margins are that razor thin, you don't find horsepower in chunks, you find it in crumbs. A little bit of flow here, a little bit of friction reduction there. Finding 5 horsepower was a cause for celebration. Finding 10 was a miracle. So imagine the panic in the pits when Bob Glidden suddenly found, and I'm not exaggerating here, 200 horsepower. Not at the finish line, but right at the launch, exactly where it mattered most. Now, you might be thinking, 200 horsepower? That's impossible without a power adder. And you'd be right. The rules of Pro Stock were etched in stone. Naturally aspirated engines only. No superchargers, no turbos, and definitely, absolutely, under penalty of lifetime bans, no nitrous oxide. Nitrous was for the bracket racers and the outlaws. It had no place in the professional, naturally aspirated purity of Pro Stock. But here is where the story shifts from a racing documentary to a heist movie. The rulebook, as thick as it was, had a blind spot. It spent pages detailing what couldn't go into the engine during the run. It had strict guidelines on displacement, weight, and fuel, but it was surprisingly vague about what you could do to the air before it entered the engine. See, an engine is just an air pump. That's the oldest cliche in the book, but stay with me. The more air you can stuff into the cylinders, the more fuel you can burn, and the more power you make. There are 2 ways to get more air in. One is forced induction, shoving it in with a turbo. That was illegal. The other way is to make the air denser. Basic physics, the stuff you probably slept through in high school, tells us that cold air is denser than hot air. The molecules huddle closer together. This is why your car feels a little peppier on a crisp October morning than it does in the dead of July. In racing terms, we call this density altitude. If you can lower the temperature of the air entering your engine, you are effectively racing at sea level, while your opponent is racing on top of a mountain. Glidden knew this. Everyone knew this. It wasn't a secret. Mechanics would pack bags of ice on their intake manifolds in the pits to try and cool them down before a run. But the moment you started the engine, that heat soaked right back in. The aluminum intake sits right on top of a raging V8 engine. It gets hot, fast. By the time you did your burnout and pulled up to the staging beams, that intake manifold was 150 degrees or hotter. You were breathing hot, thin, garbage air. So Bob Glidden asked a question that nobody else was asking. He looked at the nitrous oxide system in his car. Now, wait, I know I said nitrous was illegal, and it was, but every Pro Stock car had a nitrous bottle in it. Why? For testing. It was standard procedure to have a system installed so you could make test hits during the week, or for match races where the rules were looser. But on Sunday, during the NHRA national event, that bottle had to be closed, and the lines had to be disconnected or clearly inactive. However, the plumbing was still there, and part of a nitrous system is the purge. If you've ever watched The Fast and the Furious, you know what a purge looks like. It's that dramatic plumes of white gas shooting out of the cowl near the windshield. The purpose is practical. You want to clear the air bubbles out of the line so that when you hit the button, you get pure liquid nitrous immediately. If you don't purge, your car bogs down for a split second. Every racer purged. It was part of the ritual. Pull up to the water box, do your burnout, roll forward, purge the system to make sure the solenoids are clicking, and get ready to stage. The gas shoots up into the air and dissipates. Wasted. Glidden looked at that wasted gas and saw an opportunity. See, nitrous oxide isn't just an oxygen carrier, it's a cryogen. When it leaves the pressurized bottle and hits the atmosphere, it expands rapidly. And when a gas expands, it cools drastically. We're talking about a temperature drop to nearly 127 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Most racers saw the purge as a cleaning cycle. Glidden saw it as a liquid ice pack. He started wondering, what if I didn't shoot that freezing cold gas into the air? What if I shot it somewhere else? Not into the engine, that would be illegal, but what if I shot it at the engine? This is where it gets really interesting. Glidden realized that the rulebook said no power adders introduced into the combustion chamber during the run. It didn't say anything about no air conditioning for the intake manifold. He went into his garage and started fabricating. He took the standard purge lines that usually pointed at the windshield and rerouted them. He drilled holes into the bottom of his intake manifold, a beautiful custom sheet metal tunnel ram that was already a work of art. He plumbed the purge nozzles inside the manifold, hidden deep in the plenum, right under the carburetors. The genius here wasn't just the plumbing, it was the concealment. From the outside, the car looked totally legal. The nitrous lines ran to the solenoids just like everyone else. But when Glidden hit the purge button, the gas didn't go up, it went in. It would swirl around inside that aluminum box, instantly freezing the metal. I mean, we're talking about dropping the temperature of the intake manifold from 150 degrees to 30 degrees in seconds. The aluminum would get so cold it would contract. The air inside that manifold would become dense, heavy, and rich with oxygen. But here is the key, and this is the part that kept him legal, technically speaking. He would do this before the run, in the staging lanes. He'd hit the button, flood the manifold with freezing gas, and let it chill the metal. By the time he actually staged the car and the light turned green, the nitrous gas itself was gone. It had dissipated or been sucked out. There was no nitrous oxide entering the cylinders during the race. So was he using nitrous to make power? No, he was using nitrous to create a climate. He was manufacturing a blizzard inside his engine in the middle of July. When that light turned green, his engine gulped down that super dense, freezing cold air. For the first 60 feet, the most critical part of a drag race, his engine was making power numbers that shouldn't have been mathematically possible for a naturally aspirated small block. This wasn't just an advantage, it was an assassination. You're standing at the starting line of the US Nationals, and the air is thick with tension and unburnt fuel. In the other lane, you have a legend like Warren Johnson or Grumpy Jenkins, men with factory backing and budgets that could fund a small country. They are doing their burnouts, purging their nitrous systems into the air like responsible, rule-abiding citizens. Violent hisses of white vapor shoot skyward, clearing the lines. It's loud, it's aggressive, it's normal. Then you look over at Bob Glidden in his Ford Fairmont. He does his burnout, he rolls forward, but when he purges, something is wrong. There is no violent hiss. There is no plume of white smoke shooting into the grandstands. Instead, there is just a muffled, strange whoosh sound coming from under the hood. It sounds like a deep exhale, heavy and suppressed. And then, right before your eyes, the hood scoop starts to sweat. Condensation forms instantly on the metal. In the humid Indiana heat, that cold aluminum acts like a magnet for moisture. If you were close enough to touch it, your fingers would stick to the intake manifold. The tree drops. Green light. Now, usually, a Pro Stock car leaves a line with a certain rhythm. It squats, the tires wrinkle, and it accelerates hard. But Glidden's car didn't just accelerate, it exploded. We're talking about a launch so violent that the front wheels would hang in the air for 60 feet, carrying them well past the Christmas tree. While everyone else was cutting 1.15 second 60-foot times, which, by the way, is incredibly fast, Glidden was clicking off .95s. To put that in perspective, a 2/10th advantage in the first 60 feet of a drag race is not a gap. It is a different zip code. By the time his opponent had shifted into second gear, Glidden was already 3 car lengths ahead. The race was over before it started. This is where the physics of the situation becomes almost poetic. We talked about density altitude earlier, but let's drill down into the numbers because they are staggering. The ideal gas law states that pressure, volume, and temperature are all linked. When Glidden dumped that 127 degree below zero vapor into his intake, he wasn't just cooling the air, he was shrinking it. Think of air molecules like people in a crowded room. When they are hot, they're running around, bumping into each other, taking up space. There's a lot of energy, but not a lot of density. When you freeze them, they stop moving. They huddle together. You can fit twice as many people in the same room if they are all standing still and shivering. That is exactly what was happening inside Glidden's manifold. He was packing oxygen molecules so tightly together that when the fuel was introduced, the combustion was catastrophic, in a good way. The source data suggests he was seeing a momentary spike of 200 to 250 horsepower right at the hit. Imagine that for a second. You are driving an 800 horsepower car, and for 3 seconds, you have a magic button that turns it into a 1,000 horsepower car. But here's the kicker. Because the nitrous oxide gas itself was purged out or dissipated before the actual combustion event, the engine was technically, legally, and physically naturally aspirated during the run. The tech inspectors were baffled. They knew something was up. You don't just find 2/10ths of a second on the field by tuning your carburetor better. Warren Johnson, who is arguably the smartest man to ever sit in a race car, later admitted that he spent 6 months trying to figure it out. He said, "We knew he had something. We thought maybe it was an exotic fuel blend. Maybe he found a way to treat the metal in his block. It never occurred to us he was using the purge." And that's the beauty of the Glidden loophole. It relied on a blind spot in the human psyche. We tend to ignore the things we think are routine. The purge was a routine, throwaway moment. It was maintenance. Nobody looked at the trash, and Glidden was turning his trash into treasure. The paranoia in the pits started to reach fever pitch. Grumpy Jenkins, who was never one to suffer fools or lose quietly, filed protest after protest. He demanded teardowns. He demanded fuel checks. He was convinced Glidden was sneaking nitrous into the engine during the run. So, the NHRA officials would march over to Glidden's pit area, they would strip that Ford Fairmont down to the frame rails, they would pull the heads off the engine, they would measure the displacement, they would check the fuel lines for hidden solenoids, they would look for false floorboards or hidden switches under the dash, and every single time, they found nothing. Because there was nothing to find. The crime weapon had evaporated into the atmosphere before the car even crossed the finish line. The engine was legal, the fuel was legal, the weight was legal. The only thing illegal was the temperature of the intake manifold, and there was no rule for that. This is what makes this story so compelling to me. It wasn't about spending more money. Glidden didn't have the budget of the factory teams. He couldn't outspend GM, so he had to outthink them. He turned his garage in Whiteland, Indiana into a skunk works that rivaled NASA. He kept notebooks, stacks of them, recording barometric pressure, humidity, track temperature, and exactly how many seconds of purge were needed to hit the sweet spot. Too much purge and you risk freezing the fuel, causing it to drop out of suspension and bog the engine. Too little and you don't get the density gain. He turned the purge into an art form. He was playing an instrument while everyone else was just hammering on the keys. The 1978 season became a bloodbath. Glidden won 8 of 12 national events. He didn't just win the championship, he reset the standard for what a pro stock car could do. He broke the 8-second barrier. He broke the speed records. At the US Nationals, the Super Bowl of drag racing, he qualified number 1, set low elapsed time, set top speed, and won the race. It was a clean sweep. But here is where it gets really interesting, and where the story takes a turn toward the inevitable crackdown. Innovation in racing has a very short shelf life. Eventually, people catch on. The first clue was the frost. You can hide plumbing, you can hide solenoids, you can't hide thermodynamics. Other teams started noticing the ice on the hood scoop. They started noticing the lack of purge vapor, and slowly, the smartest minds in the paddock began to piece it together. It started with crude imitations. Teams would just plumb their purge lines into the air cleaner and hope for the best. But they didn't have Glidden's finesse. They would flood their engines and bog off the line, or they would freeze their carburetors shut. Glidden had modified his carbs with special boosters and metering blocks to handle the dense, cold air. He had drilled specific orifices to swirl the gas. He was on version 5.0 while everyone else was struggling with the beta release. But the NHRA had seen enough. They couldn't prove he was cheating because under the letter of the law he wasn't. But they knew he was making a mockery of the naturally aspirated spirit of the class. They had to stop him. But how do you ban something that isn't technically there? Their first attempt at a rule change was almost comical. In late 1979, they issued a mandate. All nitrous purge lines must vent to the outside atmosphere. Simple, right? Problem solved. Glidden looked at the new rule, smiled, and said, "Okay." He moved his purge lines. Instead of pointing them inside the manifold, he pointed them right at the opening of his hood scoop. Technically, they were venting to the atmosphere. They just happened to be venting into the exact stream of air that was about to be sucked into his engine. He was following the letter of the law while completely ignoring the spirit of it, and it still worked. The car was still a rocket ship. The officials were furious. They realized they were playing checkers while Glidden was playing 4D chess. So they tried again. The next rule was more specific. Purge lines must be directed away from any engine inlet. Glidden's response? He pointed the nozzles backward, toward the windshield, but he angled them perfectly so the gas would hit the glass, bank off the windshield, and roll right back down into the cowl induction scoop. It was geometry weaponized against bureaucracy. This cat-and-mouse game went on for 2 full seasons. It was the most entertaining regulatory battle in the history of the sport. Every time they tried to box him in, he found a new window. But eventually, the NHRA had to drop the hammer. They realized that they couldn't just regulate the plumbing. They had to regulate the temperature itself. They had to legislate the weather. And that leads us to the nuclear option, the rule change that finally ended the party and changed the sport forever. The 1981 rulebook update wasn't just a revision, it was a surrender document. The NHRA officials had tried being polite, they had tried being specific. Now they were just being angry. The new regulation, often whispered about in the pits as the Glidden rule, was draconian in its simplicity. All nitrous purge systems must vent through a dedicated outlet mounted at least 12 inches from any part of the intake system, pointing upward or rearward with NHRA text stickers on the purge lines to prevent tampering. Any vapor entering the engine inlet, intentional or not, will result in immediate disqualification. But they didn't stop there. They knew Glidden would just find a way to bounce the vapor off a cloud if he had to. So for the first time in history, they decided to regulate temperature. Tech inspectors were issued handheld infrared thermometers, expensive high-tech gear for the time. Their job was to walk the staging lanes like heat-seeking missiles. If they pointed that gun at your intake manifold and it read more than 10 degrees below the ambient air temperature, you were done. Pack up your trailer, go home. No appeal. It was the end of an era. The 127-degree loophole was officially closed. The frost on the hood scoop was gone. The mysterious 200 horsepower kick in the pants was legislated out of existence. Now, you might be thinking this killed Bob Glidden's career. You might assume that without his magic trick, he'd fall back to the pack, just another guy with a wrench and a dream. And this is where the story proves that the driver matters just as much as the car. Because after they banned his greatest invention, Bob Glidden didn't fade away. He got faster. He went on to win 10 NHRA Pro Stock championships. 10! In a sport where most people are lucky to win one race in a lifetime, this man dominated for 2 decades. The purge system was just one weapon in an arsenal that included relentless work ethic, brilliant chassis tuning, and an uncanny ability to read the track surface. But that purge system, that was the moment he went from being a great racer to a legend. It was the moment he proved that the rulebook is just a starting point for negotiation. Here's the thing about innovation in motorsports. It never stays contained. You can ban it in one series, but the knowledge escapes. It leaks out like nitrous vapor. By 1982, the secret was out. The automotive aftermarket, which is always hungry for the next big thing, jumped on it. You could buy cryo purge kits for your street car. Nitrous companies, the same ones who had been selling bottles for off-road use only, started marketing cold shot systems. They would sell you a kit specifically designed to spray nitrous across an intercooler or into an air intake piping solely for the cooling effect. NASCAR teams, who are notoriously secretive, started experimenting with chemical intercooling in the mid-80s. They couldn't use nitrous, of course, but they looked at other ways to supercool the fuel and air charge. Rumors of dry ice and air cleaners, fuel lines routed through ice chests, and obscure chemical additives in the gas tank started floating around the garages in Daytona and Talladega. Even Formula One, the pinnacle of high-tech racing, briefly flirted with pre-race intake cooling before the FIA stepped in with their own banhammer. Today, if you look at modern Pro Mod or Radio versus the World classes, you see the legacy of Glidden's idea everywhere. These are cars making 4,000 horsepower with twin turbos and methanol. They use CO2 or compressed air to manage wastegates and shifters. And yes, they still struggle with heat soak. The principles of thermal management that Glidden pioneered in a garage in Indiana are now standard operating procedure for every high-end race team on the planet. But let's step back for a second. Why does this story matter? Why are we talking about a guy cooling down an aluminum box 40 years ago? Because it represents the fundamental conflict at the heart of all competition. There is a tension between the spirit of the rules and the letter of the rules. The NHRA wants a fair fight. They want parity. They want the best driver to win, not the best lawyer or the best chemist. But the racer? The racer doesn't care about fair. The racer cares about winning. There is a famous quote by Mark Donohue, the engineer driver behind the unfair advantage. He said that if you can't find an unfair advantage, you aren't trying hard enough. Glidden lived that philosophy. He didn't break the rules, he transcended them. He looked at a book of thou shalt nots and found the white space between the lines where thou shalt was still waiting to be written. This mindset is what drives technological progress. Think about it. Every major leap forward in automotive engineering, fuel injection, active suspension, aerodynamics, traction control, started as a cheat in racing. It started as someone trying to get around the restriction. The modern Pro Stock rulebook is now 184 pages long. In 1978, it was 12 pages. Those extra 172 pages, they aren't there because the cars got more complicated. They are there because of people like Bob Glidden. They are a fossil record of ingenuity. Each new rule, each new paragraph is a tombstone for a brilliant idea that worked too well. When you see a Pro Stock car today, it is a marvel of engineering. It has computer-controlled fuel injection, data acquisition systems that record thousands of parameters per second, and aerodynamic packages developed in wind tunnels. It runs 6.40s at over 210 miles per hour. It makes 1,400 horsepower naturally aspirated. But watch what happens when they stage. Watch the purge. The driver hits the button, a plume of white smoke shoots straight up into the air away from the engine, exactly as the rules require. It dissipates harmlessly into the atmosphere. It is wasted potential. It is inefficiency mandated by law. Every time I see that cloud of vapor, I think of Bob Glidden. I think of the frost on the hood scoop. I think of the panic in Warren Johnson's eyes. And I think about what could have been if they had just let him keep doing it. We often talk about the golden era of drag racing, and usually people mean the 60s with the gassers and the AFX cars. But for me, the golden era was the late 70s and early 80s. It was the last time a guy could outsmart a factory. It was the last time you could build something in your garage that the world's biggest corporations couldn't understand. Today, racing is different. It's spec this and balance of performance that. If you show up with a car that is 0.2 faster than everyone else, they don't give you a trophy, they give you a penalty weight. They slow you down to make the show better for TV. Glidden came from an era where if you were faster, you were just faster. If you found 200 horsepower in a purge valve, good for you, until they caught you. Bob passed away in 2017. The racing world lost a titan. At his funeral, stories were told, not just about his wins, but about his mind. Warren Johnson, his fiercest rival, the man who spent 6 months chasing a ghost, stood up and paid his respects. He said Bob didn't just race cars, he reimagined what racing could be. That purge system, that was pure genius. I hated losing to it, but I respected the hell out of it. That respect is the currency of the paddock. You don't get respect for following the rules. You get respect for bending them so far they almost break, but stopping just before they snap. So the next time you are watching a race, look for the anomalies. Look for the things that don't make sense. Look for the car that sounds different or the team that is doing something weird in the pits. Because somewhere, in some garage right now, there is another Bob Glidden looking at a rulebook and smiling. He's seeing something we don't. He's finding the next loophole. And when he finds it, the rulebook will get a little bit thicker. But the story doesn't end with Glidden. His influence rippled out into every form of motorsport, and even into the cars you drive today. The idea that cold is power is now fundamental. Your turbocharged daily driver has an intercooler because of the physics Glidden was exploiting. Your cold air intake is a direct descendant of that frosted hood scoop. The legacy isn't just in the record books, it's under your hood. But you know, to really appreciate the magnitude of what Bob Glidden pulled off, you have to look at the company he keeps in the history books. He wasn't operating in a vacuum. He was part of a golden lineage of what I like to call the glorious bastards of motorsport. I'm talking about guys like Smokey Yunick. You know the story of Smokey Chevelle, the one that was supposedly a 7/8 scale replica of a real car because it was aerodynamically slicker. Or the time NASCAR officials pulled his fuel tank because they thought it was too big, and he drove the car back to the pits with the tank sitting on the ground because he had hidden 5 gallons of fuel in the roll cage tubing. That is the level of genius we are dealing with here. But there is a key difference between Smokey and Glidden. Smokey's tricks were often mechanical audibles, shaving weight, hiding fuel, bending bodywork. They were structural. Glidden's trick was chemical, it was invisible, it was elegant in a way that bending sheet metal isn't. And here is where the story gets even deeper, into the technical weeds that most people overlook. To understand why the nitrous purge was so effective for Glidden specifically, you have to look at the engine he was running. The Ford 351 Cleveland. Now look, the Cleveland is a legendary engine, but in 1978, it was fighting a losing battle against the big block Chevys and the Hemis. The Hemi is a massive air punk. It has huge valves, a cross-flow head design, and it moves air like a hurricane. The big block Chevy is a torque monster. The Cleveland, it was a small block, a high-revving, canted valve small block. The Cleveland heads were famous for having massive ports. Some people said they were too big for a streetcar. At low RPM, the air velocity was lazy, but at 9,000 or 10,000 RPM, where Glidden lived, those heads flowed like fire hoses. However, high RPM engines are incredibly sensitive to air density. When you're spinning a motor that fast, the window of time to fill the cylinder is microscopic. You need every molecule of oxygen you can get. A big, lazy Hemi might forgive a little hot air because it has displacement on its side. A high-strung, small displacement Cleveland running at the ragged edge, it needs perfect conditions. So when Glidden dropped the intake temperature by 60 degrees, he wasn't just adding power, he was fixing the one weakness of his engine architecture. He was giving that small block the lung capacity of a big block. It was a perfect marriage of problem and solution. And this brings up another fascinating point about the unfair advantage. It's rarely just one thing. It's a system. The purge cooled the intake cooled the air. The denser air required different jetting in the carburetors. The carburetors required a different fuel curve. Glidden had to re-engineer the entire top end of his motor to take advantage of a trick that only lasted for 3 seconds. Most racers would have stopped at, hey, cold air is good. Glidden went, okay, cold air is good, but now my fuel is dropping out of suspension because the manifold is too cold. So I need to redesign the booster venturies to atomize the fuel better at low temperatures. That is the difference between a mechanic and an engineer. A mechanic fixes the problem. An engineer exploits the solution. Now, let's talk about the psychological warfare aspect of this, because I think it's just as important as the horsepower. Imagine you're a young racer in 1979. You've scraped together every dollar you have. You've mortgaged your house. You've built a car that is legal, fast, and competitive. You pull up to the line next to Bob Glidden. You see the frost, you hear the weird whoosh. You know he is doing something you don't understand. That defeats you before the light even goes green. You start overdriving. You try to cut a perfect light and you red light. You miss a shift because you are watching his lane instead of your tachometer. Glidden didn't just have a horsepower advantage, he had a rent-free advantage. He was living in their heads. There is a story, I can't verify it, but it's part of the pit lore, that Glidden would sometimes purge the system even when he didn't need to, just to watch the other team scramble. He would do it in the pits, let the frost build up, and then wipe it off with a rag right before he went out, just to let them know he could. That is the swagger of a man who knows he has the ace of spades in his pocket. But let's pivot for a second. What if the NHRA hadn't banned it? What if they had said, you know what, this is clever. It's naturally aspirated, we will allow it. Where would we be today? I think we would have seen a completely different evolution of the internal combustion engine in racing. We would have seen thermal management become a dedicated discipline, just like aerodynamics or suspension tuning. You would have seen intake manifolds with integrated cooling jackets run by liquid nitrogen. You would have seen fuel rails that were refrigerated. We might have even seen the development of active intakes that could change their temperature based on where the car was on the track, cold for the launch, warm for the top end to reduce friction. Instead, the NHRA closed that door, and in doing so, they forced innovation into other, more expensive areas. When you can't find free horsepower with a 50-cent piece of hose and a valve, you have to find it by spending $50,000 on cylinder head development. This is the irony of rulemaking. The NHRA banned the purge to keep costs down and keep the field level, but by banning the cheap, clever solution, they forced everyone to spend millions on the expensive, complex solutions. Glidden's trick cost him maybe $20 in parts. The aerodynamic programs that replaced it cost millions. So, in a way, the Glidden rule actually made racing more expensive. It took the power out of the hands of the garage mechanic and put it into the hands of the wind tunnel engineer. That's something most people don't realize about regulations. They rarely save money, they just move the spending to a different department. But let's get back to the man himself. Bob Glidden was a grinder. He wasn't a media darling like Jungle Jim Lieberman. He wasn't a showman like John Force. He was quiet. He was serious. He looked like a guy who fixed your furnace, not a guy who was rewriting the laws of physics. He worked 18-hour days. His wife, Etta, was his crew chief for years. His sons, Billy and Rusty, grew up in the shop. It was a family business in the truest sense. And I think that's why this specific loophole resonates so much with us. If Ferrari finds a loophole in F1, we shrug. Of course they did. They have 1,000 engineers. But when a guy from Whiteland, Indiana finds a loophole that baffles the biggest organizations in the world, that's Rocky Balboa stuff. That's the American dream with a 351 Cleveland soundtrack. And it wasn't just the purge. Glidden was also the master of the invisible chassis tweaks. He would move suspension pickup points by 1/8 of an inch, just enough to change the instant center of the car, but not enough for the tech inspector to notice with a tape measure. He would acid dip bolts to save ounces. He understood that a race car is a living organism. Everything affects everything else. If you cool the intake, you change the weight distribution because the fuel burns differently. If you change the weight distribution, you need to adjust the wheelie bars. The purge was just a headline. The book was 1,000 pages of obsession. But there is a darker side to this obsession too. The burnout, the stress. When you are that far ahead, you are constantly looking over your shoulder. You know they're coming for you. You know the rule change is inevitable. Glidden raced with a chip on his shoulder the size of a slick. He felt the factory teams look down on him. He felt the NHRA was out to get him. And to be fair, they kind of were. When you win that much, you become the villain. People stop rooting for Goliath, even if Goliath started as David. By 1980, the tide was turning. The Glidden rule was looming. The other teams were catching up. The Lee Shepherds and the Warren Johnsons were closing the gap. The free lunch was over. And that is usually where the story ends for the one-trick pony. The gimmick gets banned and the driver disappears. But Glidden didn't disappear. And that is what I want to talk about next. How do you pivot when your greatest weapon is taken away? How do you reinvent yourself when the world says you are done? When the gavel finally came down in 1981 and the Glidden rule became law, the paddock held its breath. The whispering campaign started immediately. He's done, they said. He was a one-trick pony. Take away his ice-cold intake and he's just another guy in a Ford. And for a lesser racer, that might have been true. If your entire competitive advantage hangs on a single gimmick, you are fragile. But Bob Glidden wasn't fragile. He was forged in iron. When the NHRA took away his thermal advantage, he didn't complain to the press. He didn't threaten to quit. He went back to the dyno. He looked at the rulebook again. Okay, he probably thought, I can't cool the air before the run, so I have to make the engine breathe better with the hot air I have. He threw himself into cylinder head development with a manic intensity. He started experimenting with port shapes that nobody else would touch. He raised the exhaust ports. He changed the valve angles. He realized that if he couldn't increase the density of the air charge, he had to increase the velocity. He had to make the air move so fast that the heat didn't matter. The result? He came out swinging. He won the championship in 1985, and 1986, and 1987, and 1988. In fact, his most dominant years came after the ban. The purge system was the spark that lit the fire, but the inferno that followed was fueled by pure, unadulterated engineering genius. This is the part of the story that really gets me. We love the magic bullet stories. We love the idea that one clever trick can win the race. But the reality of motorsport, and maybe life, is that the trick only gets you so far. The trick gets you the lead. The work keeps it. Glidden proved that he didn't need the loophole to win. He used the loophole because it was there, and because leaving performance on the table was a sin against the god of speed.
But when the loophole closed, he just found another way. By the mid-80s, he had transitioned to the Ford Thunderbird, a car that became synonymous with his name. It was slippery, it was fast, and it was legal. But every time he pulled up to the staging lanes, you could see the other drivers watching him. They weren't looking at his tires. They weren't looking at his wheelie bars. They were looking at his hood scoop. They were looking for the frost. They were haunted by the ghost of an advantage that wasn't there anymore. That is the ultimate victory, when your competitors are so afraid of your mind that they see monsters where there are only shadows. So, what is the legacy of the 127-degree loophole? It's more than just a cool story about nitrous oxide. It's a lesson in perspective. Most people look at a set of rules, whether it's for racing, business, or life, and see a cage. They see a list of things they can't do. They see boundaries. Bob Glidden looked at the same rules and saw a map. He saw a landscape of opportunities hidden in the phrasing. He understood that a rule is defined just as much by what it doesn't say as by what it does. The rulebook said naturally aspirated. It didn't say ambient temperature. That gap, that tiny sliver of silence in the text, was where he built his empire. Today, drag racing is tighter than ever. The cars are separated by 10,000ths of a second. The rulebook is locked down. Every part is scanned, measured, and certified. You can't get away with a hidden nitrous purge anymore. The Wild West days are gone. But the spirit remains. Walk through the pits at any NHRA national event today. Look at the crew chiefs staring at their laptops. Look at the engine builders peering into the ports of a cylinder head. They are all searching for their own version of the frost. They are all looking for that one thing, that one tiny invisible thing that the rule makers forgot to mention. And every now and then, someone finds it. It might be a new way to map the fuel curve. It might be a new coating for the piston skirts. It might be an aerodynamic tweak that looks like a mistake but acts like a wing. And when they find it, for a fleeting moment, they get to feel what Bob Glidden felt in 1978. They get to feel the thrill of knowing something the rest of the world doesn't. They get to be the smartest person in the room. Until the rulebook updates. The 1978 U.S. Nationals will always be remembered for that white Ford Fairmont. It wasn't the fastest car ever built. It wasn't the most beautiful. But for one summer, it was magic. It was a machine that turned a fire extinguisher into a supercharger. It was a car that breathed ice in the middle of a heat wave. And it was driven by a man who taught us all a very important lesson. If you can't beat them with horsepower, beat them with brain power. And if the rules say you can't do it, read them again. You might be surprised at what they don't say. This story isn't just about drag racing. It's about the relentless human drive to push beyond the limits. It's about the refusal to accept good enough. It's about looking at a wall and seeing a door. Whatever you are building, whatever you are racing, whatever you are chasing, don't just follow the line. Look for the spaces in between. Look for the gray areas, because that is where the magic happens. That is where the championships are won. And if you ever find yourself in a garage late at night staring at a problem that seems impossible, just remember the frost on the hood scoop. Remember that the solution might be right in front of you, hidden in something as simple as a purge valve. I want to hear from you guys. What is the most creative interpretation of the rules you have ever seen? Whether it's in racing, gaming, or just everyday life. Drop a comment below. I read all of them, and I'm always looking for the next great story of ingenuity. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the brilliant mind of Bob Glidden, make sure to subscribe. We are just scratching the surface of automotive history, and there are a lot more loopholes to explore. Until next time, keep your intake cold and your reading glasses handy.